The first time the folks of Dry Creek saw her step down from the stagecoach, the wind was howling like a lonesome wolf across the prairie, and the dust clung to her gray traveling dress like the past, refusing to let go. She stood there stiff as a fence post, gloved hands folded tight around a small leather valise, eyes the color of winter skies staring straight ahead as if she dared the world to challenge her. The driver tipped his hat and offered a hand, but she barely nodded in thanks. Not a smile, not a flicker of warmth, just silence. Folks whispered behind calloused palms. "Maylord her bride," they said, "come all the way from back east to marry a rancher she'd never met." "Poor girl," one woman muttered. But the bride did not look poor. She looked carved from stone, like something life had chiseled too many times. Silas Turner watched from the porch of the Mercantile, thumbs hooked in his gun belt, hat pulled low against the glare of the afternoon sun. He had expected nerves, maybe even tears, but not that face, that still, untouchable calm that felt colder than a December river. The letter she'd written him months ago had been neat and polite, full of gratitude and simple hopes. She had signed it, Abigail Rose Whitmore, and somewhere between the ink and the paper he had imagined a woman with a shy laugh and hopeful eyes. Instead, the woman standing before him now looked like she had buried every laugh she ever owned, and Silas felt something tighten in his chest. Not regret, not yet, but something close. He stepped forward, boots thudding against the wooden boards of the sidewalk, and removed his hat. "Miss Whitmore," he said, voice deep and careful, as though speaking too loud might shatter her. "I'm Silas Turner." She turned those pale eyes toward him, studying him like she was measuring the strength of a bridge before daring to cross it. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with sun-browned skin and a scar tracing his jaw from some long-forgotten bar fight. He waited for a reaction, a softening perhaps, but she only inclined her head once. "Mr. Turner," she replied, her voice smooth and distant as a train whistle. At night, they walked side by side toward his ranch at the edge of town, her riding pillion on his old chestnut mare, keeping a careful distance even though the saddle forced them close. The prairie stretched wide and endless, grass bending like waves beneath the wind, a sky so large it could swallow a person whole. Silas tried once or twice to speak of the land, of the cattle herd, of the house he had built with his own hands, but her answers came short and polite. "Yes, sir," "No, sir," "That sounds suitable," "Sir." Every word carried the weight of duty, not desire. And when they reached the small white ranch house with its wraparound porch and sturdy barn out back, she slid down from the horse without waiting for his hand inside the house. Everything was clean and prepared. A vase of wildflowers sat on the table, bright yellows and blues gathered that morning. The curtains were new, sewn by Mrs. Parker from town, and the bed in the main room had been fitted with a quilt Silas's late mother once stitched. He watched Abigail take it all in, her gaze moving slowly across the room, but her face did not change, not even at the sight of the flowers. "I hope it's to your liking," he said, suddenly unsure of himself in his own home. "It is adequate," she answered softly, placing her valise on the table as if setting down a burden she intended to keep close. The wedding was held the very next morning under the cottonwood tree beside the barn, with half the town gathered out of curiosity, if not kindness. The preacher spoke of partnership and patience, of love growing like crops from careful tending. Silas said his vows steady and sure, promising protection, provision, and respect. Abigail repeated hers without falter, her tone even and calm. When the preacher declared them husband and wife, Silas leaned forward to brush a gentle kiss against her cheek. The crowd waited for the bride to blush or grin, but she only stood there, eyes forward, lips straight as a drawn line, and somewhere in the murmuring wind, disappointment rustled through the onlookers like dry leaves days, turned into a pattern of quiet footsteps and distant conversations. Abigail rose before dawn to cook breakfast, her movements precise and efficient. She mended shirts, scrubbed floors, tended the small vegetable patch behind the house, never once complaining, never once laughing. Silas tried to draw her out with small kindnesses, bringing her a ribbon from town, setting aside the best cut of meat for supper, telling stories of his boyhood mischief along the riverbank, but her responses were always the same polite nod, the faintest curve of gratitude that never reached her eyes. At night she lay stiff beside him, a careful inch of space between them, as if even in sleep she guarded something fragile and broken. One evening, as the sun melted into streaks of orange and crimson across the horizon, Silas found her standing alone by the fence line, staring west as though expecting someone to come riding over the hill. The cattle lowed softly behind her, and the breeze tugged at the loose strands of her dark hair. "You miss home," he said gently, stepping up beside her. "Home is no longer a place," she answered, her voice carrying a weight heavier than any trunk she had brought with her. "It is simply a memory." Silas studied her then, truly studied her, and saw it, the grief buried deep beneath that calm exterior, the hurt that had turned her smiles into ghosts. He cleared his throat, unsure why his next words felt so important, and said softly, "Well, you're here now, darling, and this land can be home if you let it." The words slipped from him easy and natural, and for the briefest second, as the sky burned gold around them, something flickered in Abigail's eyes, not quite a smile, but no longer stone either. Silas did not know he had done anything worth noticing. The word Darlin had come as natural as breathing, carried on the same wind that bent the tall prairie grass and cooled the heat of the setting sun. But Abigail noticed. She felt it settle against the ache inside her chest like a warm coal refusing to die out. No one had called her anything soft in a long while. Back east, she had been Miss Whitmore, then simply Abigail, and after her father's debts swallowed their home, she had been a burden whispered about behind closed doors. Yet here in Dry Creek, beneath a sky wide enough to forgive anyone, a cowboy had called her Darlin, and it had not sounded like possession. It had sounded like promise. The next morning she woke before dawn, as always, the habit stitched deep into her bones. She moved quietly from the bed so as not to disturb Silas, tying her hair back with steady hands. But as she stood at the stove stirring cornmeal into boiling water, she found herself replaying the sound of his voice, low and certain. "Darlin'," she scolded herself for foolishness. Words were wind, and wind changed direction without warning. Still, when Silas entered the kitchen rubbing sleep from his eyes, she did not look away as quickly as she once had. "Morning," he said, and after a pause that felt heavier than it should, he added, "Morning, Darlin'." The word warmed the small room better than the fire crackling in the hearth. Silas noticed the difference, though he could not name it. Abigail's shoulders seemed less rigid, her replies less clipped. When he thanked her for the biscuits she had baked, she answered with something almost resembling humor. "They would be less fit for cattle today," she said softly, and for a fleeting second the corner of her mouth curved upward. Silas nearly dropped his coffee cup. It was not a full smile, not yet, but it was proof she was not carved from stone after all. He felt a stubborn determination settle inside him, the same grit that had carried him through drought and cattle sickness. If patience could grow corn from dry soil, perhaps it could coax joy from a wounded heart later that week. Trouble came riding hard across the prairie, in the form of a dust storm rolling in from the west. The sky turned a bruised shade of brown, and the air thickened with grit. Silas hurried to secure the barn doors while Abigail gathered laundry from the line. The wind howled fierce and wild, snatching at her skirts and tangling her hair. Silas ran to her side without thinking, gripping her arm to steady her as the first wall of dust hit. "I've got you, darling," he shouted over the roar. She did not pull away this time. Instead, she held on to him, fingers clutching the front of his shirt, as if anchoring herself to something solid at last. Together they stumbled toward the house, united against the storm rather than divided by silence. When the storm finally passed, leaving the world coated in a fine layer of dust, they sat on the porch steps, side by side, breathing in the clean scent of rain that followed. Abigail's hands trembled faintly, not from fear of the storm but from something deeper. "I used to be afraid of these," she admitted quietly. "My mother would light candles and pray the roof would hold." Her voice faltered at the mention of her mother, and for the first time Silas heard the grief beneath her calm. "You lost them both," he said gently, recalling the brief line in her letter about illness taking her family. She nodded once, eyes fixed on the horizon. "I lost everything," she whispered, "including the part of me that believed in happiness." Silas leaned back against the porch post, hat resting on his knee. "I won't pretend to know that kind of loss," he said slowly, "but I know something about starting over. This land wasn't always kind to me. It took years before it gave back more than it stole." Abigail glanced at him then, curiosity flickering through her guarded expression. "Why stay?" she asked. "If it hurt you so," he gave a small shrug. "Because quitting would have meant the hurt one, and I ain't much for letting pain have the final say." The simplicity of his answer settled into her like seeds waiting for rain that evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of violet and gold. Abigail did something she had not done since arriving in Dry Creek. She brought a small leather valise to the kitchen table and opened it fully in front of Silas. Inside lay a bundle of letters tied with ribbon, a silver locket, and a faded photograph of a modest house framed by maple trees. "This was home," she said softly, tracing the edges of the photograph. "It was not grand, but it was ours." Silas studied the picture with quiet respect. "It looks sturdy," he remarked. "A good place for laughter." The word laughter seemed to echo between them. Fragile yet hopeful, she closed the valise gently and looked at him in a way she never had before. Not as a stranger bound by ink and vows, but as a man standing patiently at the edge of her guarded world. "When you call me that," she began hesitantly, "Darlin, it feels as though you were speaking to someone I used to be, someone who believed she deserved kindness." Silas met her gaze steady and warm. "Maybe I'm speaking to who you still are," he replied. The prairie lay quiet outside, stars beginning to scatter across the vast night sky, and in the hush of that western evening, Abigail felt a crack spread through the armor around her heart. Not enough for a full smile, not yet, but enough to let a sliver of light slip through. And for the first time since stepping off that stagecoach, she wondered if perhaps Dry Creek held more than duty for her. Perhaps it held the promise of feeling alive again. Winter crept over Dry Creek, slow and steady, frosting the fence posts and turning the prairie silver beneath the pale morning sun. The days grew shorter, the nights longer, and the ranch settled into a quiet rhythm of survival and small comforts. Abigail found herself lingering by the window some evenings, watching Silas chop wood with sleeves rolled high, his breath rising in soft clouds against the cold. There was something steady about him, something that did not shift like the winds she had known back east. He called her Darlin as naturally as he saddled his horse, as easily as he said grace before supper, and each time the word fell softer against her heart, smoothing edges that had once felt sharp and untouchable. One bitter afternoon, news rode in with Mr. Parker from town. A neighboring rancher had lost several cattle to sickness, and worry spread quicker than frost across Dry Creek. Silas hitched up his horse to ride out and lend a hand. He paused at the doorway, glancing back at Abigail. "I might be gone till morning, Darlin," he said, pulling on his gloves. She stepped forward without hesitation. "Then I'll keep the fire lit," she replied, her voice stronger than it had ever sounded before. He studied her a moment, seeing not the distant bride from months past, but a woman standing beside him in spirit. When the door closed behind him, she did not feel abandoned. She felt entrusted that night. The wind picked up again, rattling shutters and moaning through the eaves. Abigail sat by the hearth with the silver locket resting warm in her palm. She opened it slowly, revealing the tiny painted portraits of her mother and father inside. "I am trying," she whispered into the quiet room, "trying to live again." Tears welled in her eyes, but they did not carry the same hollow ache they once had. They felt cleansing, like spring rain washing winter from the earth. For the first time she allowed herself to imagine laughter filling these walls, children's boots by the door, the scent of fresh bread mingling with Silas's deep voice calling her from the yard. Silas returned at dawn, weary but satisfied that the cattle had been saved. Snow dusted his shoulders as he stepped inside, and the first thing he saw was Abigail waiting for him with a steaming cup of coffee. "You kept the fire burning," he said with a tired grin. "Just as I promised, Darlin," she answered before thinking. The words slipped from her lips natural and warm, and they both froze for a heartbeat. Silas's eyes widened slightly, and then he smiled, a slow spreading warmth that reached all the way to his scarred jaw. "That's the first time you've called me anything sweet," he teased gently, and for a moment the air felt charged with something brighter than the winter sun. Spring arrived, bold and certain, chasing away the last stubborn patches of snow and painting the prairie in waves of green. Wildflowers dotted the fields in bursts of yellow and violet, and the cottonwood tree beside the barn budded with fresh leaves. Abigail walked the fence line one morning with Silas, her skirt brushing against new grass. She spoke freely now, telling him stories of her childhood, of baking pies with her mother and racing her father to the mailbox at the end of their lane. Silas listened close, laughing at the right moments, asking questions, and calling her Darlin as if the word had always belonged to her. They reached the hill west of the ranch, where the land rolled wide and endless beneath the sky, the same place where months ago she had stood silent and guarded. Abigail paused there and turned to Silas. The wind caught her hair, lifting it gently around her face. "I was afraid that if I smiled again, I would lose everything all over, she admitted. The prairie teaches you different, Silas replied softly. It shows you that loss and growth share the same soil. She looked at him long and steady, seeing not just the cowboy who had answered her advertisement, but the man who had given her space to grieve and courage to heal. He stepped closer, boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. I never wanted to replace what you lost, he said. I just wanted to stand beside you while you found your way back to yourself. Abigail felt the final pieces of her guarded heart settle into place. She realized that love had not come to her in a thunderclap or a grand declaration. It had come quietly, in warm cups of coffee, in shared work against dust storms, in a single word spoken with steady affection. Her fingers reached for his hand, intertwining with his calloused grip as naturally as breathing, and then, beneath the vast western sky, with the wind sighing soft through the tall grass, Abigail Rose Whitmore smiled. It was not tentative, nor fleeting, but bright and certain as the rising sun over Dry Creek. Silas caught his breath at the sight, his own grin widening as though he had just witnessed a miracle blooming from barren ground. There you are, Darlin, he murmured, brushing a thumb across her cheek. She laughed then, a clear ringing sound that carried across the prairie and seemed to settle into the bones of the ranch itself. The mail-order bride who never smiled had found her home at last, not simply in the land or the house or the name she now carried, but in the steady love of a cowboy who had called her Darlin and meant it every single time.